Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Jaiva Narottam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Dite Nashtaprayeshu Bhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttam Shloke Bhakti Bhavati Nashtake. So continuing with the discussion on Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita by Srila Goswami, Volume 2, Planting the Seed, New York City, 1965 to 1966. Chapter 20th, Stay High Forever. So the kirtan is going on at Tompkins Square Park. Prabhupada, his disciples, followers, and the visitors, the chanting and dancing. After his second kirtan, the Swami and his followers rolled up their rug, picked up the instruments, and began to leave. Bob walked back to the swings on the other side of the park to find his wife and child, but the image of Swami stayed with him. He seemed different from anyone else. His accent had been thick, yet Bob resolved to go to the storefront in a few days to hear him speak. He's a leader, thought Bob. Dan and his wife sauntered off into the park, sampling the various groups of musicians. His wife was surprised that Dan, who was usually shy, had danced at the kirtan. He said he might go over to the storefront one day and hear the Swami speak. Judy just stood there hallucinating. She held a Stay High Forever pamphlet in her hand and read it over and over and over. While she was thinking the whole event must have come from another planet, a man walked up and asked, "Would you like to go to where the Swami is?" She nodded, yes. At the storefront, one of the devotees offered Judy some prasadam, a chapati, and then invited her up to the Swami's room. Upstairs, she entered the large front room, which was filled with fragrant smoke. There were tall flower vases, and sesame seeds were on the floor. She saw the Swami bow before the little picture of Lord Chaitanya and his associates, and then stand and leave the room, closing the door behind him. Judy decided that he must have been bowing to the floor itself. Around her, everyone was softly chanting beads, and although she couldn't make out the words, it seemed peaceful. One of the Swami's disciples told her she could come into the back room, and she followed, curious. The Swami was sitting there on his mat, looking effulgent. There were about 10 other people in the room. Prabhupada asked her if she liked the chanting in the park, and she replied, "I loved it." "Do you live near here?" he asked. Judy flashed on her idea that she was the all-pervading truth and answered in a way which she thought might have sounded very mystical. "Oh, I live very near." "Good," said Swamiji. "Then you can come for our morning kirtan and class." Then she realized that she didn't live so near and would mean traveling an hour and a half from the Bronx to visit the Swami. But she decided that since he had asked her, she would come. Then she thought, I'm making this up. But Prabhupada assured her, as if knowing her thoughts, "This process is nothing you have made up. It is very old, very simple and sublime." He leaned back. "We are eternal," he said, "and everything around us is temporary." Judy was now coming down from the LSD. By the time she left the Swami, it was late. She had wanted to stay overnight, but the boys hadn't allowed her. But she was determined to join. For Bob, it seemed natural to follow up on what he had seen in the park. He began attending the evening classes, and he started reading the Bhagavatam at home and chanting. He framed the picture from the Bhagavatam dust jacket depicting the spiritual sky and placed it on a small homemade altar. He would offer flowers before the picture and sit before it, chanting Hare Krishna. Bob was fascinated by the philosophy and the books and classes, and from the very beginning he was amazed that Swamiji's teachings answered all his questions. He listened carefully and accepted. It seemed like once I had decided that he was telling the truth, I just accepted everything he said. Not that part of it was the truth, and the rest of it I would have to think about. So that That really made them, and this is the purity of Prabhupada. The people just followed him, just accepted whatever he said. And of course, Prabhupada's teachings were not based on any made-up philosophy. It was all based on scriptures. It was Monday evening after the Sunday Kirtan in the park, and Dan arrived at the storefront for Kirtan. The Kirtan was in full swing, and when he entered, the first thing he noticed was some people playing on the innards of an upright piano leaning against the wall near the door. A boy handed him some wooden sticks, and he sat down and joined in the Kirtan. Then came the Swami's lecture, which Dan thought was long and serious about how sexual desire causes bondage and suffering. The temple was crowded and stuffy, and Dan was shocked by the lecture, but he stayed on because he knew there would be another kirtan. He felt uneasy that the Swami's followers were all celibate, but because he liked the kirtans, he resolved to keep coming. The Swami wasn't quite what Dan had expected. He had imagined something of a lightened Zen Roshi, laughing and joking, with sparkling eyes and words filled with paradoxes. But he found the Swami just the opposite, very straightforward and even cutting in his speech, and his mouth turned down at the corners. Looking him look mournful, Dan happily took to the kirtans, thinking they would aid his impersonal meditation, but the lectures kept stressing that God was a person. Dan resisted. He mentally debated with Prabhupada. He was partial to Dr. Radhakrishna's interpretation of the Gita, and yet the Swami often launched ruthless attacks against such impersonal ideas. Gradually, Dan saw his impersonal barrier crumble, and he came to admit that on every count the Swami was right. Judy began attending both the morning and evening classes. She had to rise by 5 o'clock to get to the storefront on time. And her mother and father protested, but Judy didn't care. She would ride an hour and a half on the subway before dawn, downtown to the Swami's meetings, where she would be the only girl present. When the Swami heard that Judy was an art student, he asked her to paint for Krishna. She set up a canvas in the front room of the apartment, and under his guidance, she began painting. For her first assignment, he asked her to paint a portrait of his Guru Maharaj, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. He gave her a photo and instructed her. There should be a flower garland around Guru Maharaj's neck. The tilak should be yellowish, not white, and there should be no effulgence or halo around his head. Bomb. I began chanting and studying the Srimad Bhagavatam at home and attending the kirtan and classes at the storefront. After the last kirtan in the evening, the Swami would take a bowl made of simulated wood and a little paring knife and a couple of apples that had been sitting on the edge of his lectern, and he would cut the apples up in a little bowl and hand the bowl to the disciple. The disciple would then offer him the first piece, and he would pop it into his mouth. The rest of the pieces of apple would be distributed to the crowd. I remember one time when he was chewing on his piece of apple and he spit the seeds out on the floor up against the wall. They bounced off the wall onto the floor next to the dais, and I was thinking, how wonderful. No one else can do that. No one else would have the nerve to do such a day. With his aesthetic filmmaker's eye, Dan appreciated Swamiji's manner. Dan, there was a sink right next to the dais where he sat. It was so close that he could have leaned over and touched it. After cutting up an apple, he would take the scraps and just fling them into the sink. It was very casual. I was impressed by that. And one time, Brahmananda came up. I wanted 50 cents for something, and the Swami reached down and picked up his little black purse, the kind that closes by the metal clasp at the top. He snapped it open, looked inside very perspicaciously, and then his hand came up like a bird, like an eagle hovering in flight above his prey. But the hand did not pounce. It just delicately drifted down, took out 50-cent piece, and rose up again as if it were being lifted up on a balloon. It was graceful. It was a dance, a ballet. He just picked up his 50-cent piece and lifted it into Brahmanand's hand. I couldn't believe it. Someone asks you for a 50-cent piece, you just dig it in your pockets and throw it at them. But the Swami seemed to treat everything as Krishna's property. And this 50-cent piece was treated with such care. The weeks went by, some of the devotees had spoken to Bob about initiation, but he was unsure. He didn't know exactly what initiation was. But it seemed to him that the other devotees were eager to get him initiated because he was working and had a family. To Bob's way of thinking, he represented maturity to them, a middle-class American, and they were eager to land him. Bob's wife wasn't interested, and his friends were downright opposed. He couldn't spend much time with Prabhupada or the devotees, since he was either at the office or at home with his family. Bob. So they were asking me if I was interested in initiation. I said I would think about it. I hadn't stopped smoking. I hadn't made the final decision. The first real personal exchange I had with the Swami was when I asked for initiation. The rest of the time I was so much in awe of him that it didn't occur to me to say anything. I always wanted to. I felt puffed up and I always thought, well, I should be able to talk to him. Maybe I should do something. But I was always kind of reluctant to do it. I didn't think it was my place. I guess maybe I was afraid, but I was getting up early and chanting 32 rounds a day, many of them on the subway. I was afraid of the material world because I didn't have much association with devotees and I wanted to insulate myself by chanting more. Judy was another person who was considering initiation, and I asked her what she was going to do about it. And she said, I'm thinking about it. And then she told me she had decided she would get initiated and give up all her bad habits. I began to think maybe I could give up these things too. So I asked what to do. How do I approach him? And Kirtanand said, well, you go up to his room. I was surprised it was so easy. I had prepared a little speech in my mind. My dear Swamiji, would you kindly accept me as your disciple and teach me about Krishna consciousness? I went up to his room without an appointment and knocked on the door. I heard him say, come in. When I entered the room, he was sitting behind this desk. He was alone. I made obeisances and he looked at me and said, yes. And I said, Swamiji, will you make me your disciple? And that's as far as I got. I was going to say, and teach me the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. But he didn't let me finish my speech. He said, yes. It was so simple. I thought, well, there's nothing else to say. He has accepted me. So I thanked him and paid my obeisances and left. You know, you're not supposed to be here unless you're initiated, Achyutanand said. Judy was flustered. She had come upstairs, put some dirty pots in the kitchen. Oh, yes, she replied. That's just what I wanted to talk to Swamiji about. And she went into Prabhupada's room, where he was talking with a few other people. Swamiji, could I please get initiated? She asked. And he said, do you know the 4 rules? Yes. Can you follow them? Yes. Then you can be initiated in 2 weeks. Prabhupada was making it so simple and easy. Dan was also thinking about initiation, but he wanted to wait. He was chanting 16 rounds and attending all the classes. Despite his reluctant wife, he had always had difficulty with authority figures. But he would feel that the Swamiji was winning him over and wearing down his impersonal barrier. 2 weeks later, Prabhupada held another initiation ceremony. Bob became Rupanuga and Judy became Jadurani. Dan needed a little more time. And this Jadurani Mataji, as we read that she was a painter, wonderful paintings she has done for Prabhupada. Wonderful, amazing paintings. You can search her on the net. And her paintings. And now, actually, after Prabhupada left, then whatever happened, she took initiation by another Maharaj, Narayan Maharaj, and then her name became Shamrani. Yeah, I think Shamrani. And again, under Narayan Maharaj also, she made beautiful painting, amazing painting, so much of detail of Radha Krishna pastimes. She lives in Brajmandal now, near Govardhan. Very old, but it just, you have to see the paintings to believe it, what I'm saying. Chapter 21, Beyond the Lower East Side. But we were shocked that he was going to leave. I never thought that Krishna consciousness would go beyond the Lower East Side, but to speak of New York City. I thought that this was it and it would stay here eternally, Brahmananda. But Prabhupada had to go all over the world and not just at Lower East Side. Hare Krishna was becoming popular. Regular kirtans in the park, newspaper coverage. Haigreve called it the Hare Krishna explosion. The Lower East Side hippies considered the chanting of Hare Krishna one of the grooviest things happening. And that the Swami's disciples didn't take LSD, didn't seem to affect their popularity. The devotees were accepted as angelic people, carrying the peaceful chanting to others and offering free food and a free place to stay. You could get the most interesting vegetarian food free at that place if you went at the right time. And in the storefront on the shelf by the door were books from India. In the clubs, local musicians played the melody that they had picked up from the Swami when he chanted in the park and at the temple. The Lower East Side was a neighborhood of artists and musicians, and now it was also the neighborhood of Hare Krishna. Burton Green. Musicians were influenced by it, the Krishna chant, Govinda Jai Jai, and other chants. I used some of those chants when I recorded. A lot of musicians reached out for this in different ways. We would explode in a short time and blow off, but then keep the chant underneath as a basis. A lot of people found that spiritual vibration, even in the midst of the heavy music they were doing. They were becoming devotee musicians. Evening kirtans were always big. Brahmananda used to stand by the back door every night and watch the room fill up until there was no place left to sit. There was a lot of interest in the group chanting and music making, but after the kirtan, when the talk was to begin, people would start to leave. It was not uncommon for half the audience to leave before the talk began. And sometimes people would leave in the middle of the lecture also. One evening, Allen Ginsberg brought Ed Sanders and Thule Kupferberg of the Fugs to the meeting. The Fugs, a local group that had made a name for themselves, specialized in obscene lyrics. Among the Among the popular songs of Ed Sanders was Slum Goddess of the Lower East Side, Group, and I Can't Get High. Ed had wild red hair and an electric red beard, and he played a guitar during the kirtan. The devotees were happy to see their prestigious guests. The night of the Fugs, however, Prabhupada chose to speak on the illusion of sex pleasure. Sex pleasure binds us to this material world, birth after birth, he said. And he quoted, as he often did, a verse from Yamunacharya. Since I have become Krishna conscious, whenever I think of sex life with a woman, my face at once turns from it and I spit at the thought. The Fugs never returned. To speak ill of sexual pleasure was certainly not a strategic move for one who wanted to create followers among the Lower East Side hippies. But Prabhupada never considered changing his message. In fact, when Umapati had mentioned that Americans didn't like to hear that sex was only for conceiving children, Prabhupada had replied, I cannot change the philosophy to please the Americans. What about sex? As a ISKCON attorney, Steve Goldsmith, one evening speaking out from the rear of the crowded temple, sex should only be with one's wife, Prabhupada said, and that is also restricted. Sex is for the propagation of Krishna conscious children. My spiritual master used to say that to beget Krishna conscious children, he was prepared to have a sex 100 times. Of course, that is the most difficult in this age. Though therefore he remained a brahmachari. But sex is a very strong force, Mr. Goldsmith challenged. What a man feels for a woman is undeniable. Therefore, in every culture, there is an institution of marriage. Prabhupada replied, you can get yourself married and live peacefully with one woman, but the wife should not be used as a machine for sense gratification. Sex should be restricted to once a month and only for the propagation of children. Haigiri, who was seated just to the Swami's left, beside the large dangling symbol, spoke out suddenly, only once a month, and with a touch of facetious humor, he added loudly, better to forget the whole thing. Yes, that's it. Very good boy. Swamiji laughed, and others joined him. It is best not to think of it, but just to chant Hare Krishna. And he held up his hands as if he were chanting on a strand of beads. That way we'll be saved from so much botheration. Sex is like the itching sensation, that's all. And as when we scratch, it gets worse. So we should tolerate the itching and ask Krishna to help us. It's not easy. Sex is the highest pleasure in the material world, and it's also the greatest bondage. But Steve Goldsmith was shaking his head. Prabhupada looked at him, smiling. There is still a problem. It's just that, well, it's been proved dangerous to repress the sex desire. There is a theory that we have wars because people are eating meat, Prabhupada interrupted. As long as people eat meat, there will be war. And if a man eats meat, he will sure to have illicit sex also. Steve Goldsmith was an influential friend and supporter of ISKCON, but Prabhupada would not change the philosophy of Krishna consciousness to please the Americans. See, this is preaching. He wouldn't change the philosophy. And many of the, like Dr. Mishra of the yoga studio where Prabhupada was staying with him, he had changed his philosophy just to get more followers. But Prabhupada wouldn't. I guess we have a stopping point, so we can stop here. See, anybody has any questions or comments? Okay, you all have a safe and wonderful day. Hare Krishna. Jai Srila Prabhupada.